Breast milk. The eyes wide or weighty with it, the full boat or low tide of it, the leopard of it when it leaps. Nervous before a sermon, Saint Bernard prayed for help, and the Virgin appeared, babe in lap, to squirt him in the eye with a wondrous stream of it, thus gifting him with eloquence. The sun-white glow of it in dimmed down rooms across galaxies, galaxies, galaxies. The Romans admired a mother who visited her father, sentenced to starve to death in prison, and kept him alive with it, secretly, the leopard of it when it leaps. 10 children my great-grandmother nursed from one breast. The other side never made, maybe, a country doctor thought, because of her childhood polio. The creation ex nihilo of it, across the galaxy's pale cream. In a short story by Maupassant, a train is stopped far from anywhere, and one car holds 2 strangers, a very hungry man and a nursemaid, painfully engorged. And that's all you really need to know, except it occurs to me she must have been hungry too.
Well, friends, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. And you just heard a beautiful poem, Breast Milk, by the great poet and one of my personal friends, Katie Hartsock. So, Katie Hartsock, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome, Katie. Yeah.
Oh man, just now I'm gonna, Mike, I like to tell stories.
Yeah,
it's because I'm Irish.
Stories. I like your stories.
So I met Katie. I think was it the first Jesus the Imagination? And
I would have been there. So Katie, have we met? There was a dinner along, at your dinner table.
No.
Okay.
This is email.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Mary Grove College.
Oh, I was thinking of the conference that led to. Okay.
Well, it was that. Yeah. And I get this email from this woman. It's a couple great poems. And in fact, I think one of them is In Bed of Impatience, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was great poetry. And I just liked the way this person communicated. She felt like such a nice person. And then she emailed me again with a weird request.
Very weird.
That I could, what is it going to be?
Be the sponsor and godfather of her father.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
Her husband when he entered the church on Easter, which is, gosh.
I knew this, and still when I heard it again, it was weird. Yeah, even though I knew it. Yeah.
1 on 7. Yeah. 1 on 7 years ago. Right after we moved here. And I'm like, well, I've never met you. But I could do it. I mean, I couldn't go because I had responsibility.
Well, it was Easter Vigil 2017.
Yeah, the big one.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I can't come. How about you guys come over to our house for Easter dinner? And they did. That's when I met Katie and Jonathan Geltner, who we've also had on the show a couple times.
We've had him on twice. Yeah.
Yeah. And
he's a really smart guy.
Baby Harlan.
And Harlan was still in a carrier.
Yeah, he was like 3 months by then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it was.
So if this was 2017, you're now saying he's 6 years old or so?
He is. Yeah, he'll be 7 next year. Yep.
And it was as though we'd always known each other.
It was. We just fell into step and conversation right away, and like laughed at the same things and shared.
You were part of the family immediately.
It was really lovely, and like to contextualize the weird request. Jonathan had been reading Michael's work, his like sophiology and like his.
How did he first find it, Katie? Jonathan, I'm sure we've asked.
Jonathan finds books. That's just what Jonathan does. Yeah. He just finds that's part of what he does. And I mean, I think he's really done enough reading to have earned a PhD in theology by now. Yeah. But he just reads as widely as he can, especially among religious philosophers. And so he came upon Michael's work, and he's also interested in. At that point, I don't know if he was even, or if the word was going around re-enchantment, but I think he's already on to that spirit, of that search. And so he'd been reading Michael's work. I found out about JTI. I thought, that's so cool. I'm going to send this guy some poems. And he very kindly took them. And John had a long and winding way into the church and into his baptism. on Easter Vigil 2017, and we didn't know anyone to ask to be the godfather. And I thought we were like kind of sitting on the couch thinking, and I was like, well, what about Michael Martin? He's like, are you crazy? We've never even met him. And I said, but like you've read his books, like you do know him in the way that I think you get to know people when you read their books carefully and with love and appreciation. And I was like, so you do know him in a way. And I don't know. And
it's a great story, though. It's a wild story, and I've heard it before. Yeah. So again, sight unseen, you guys just called him.
Well, I wrote I think John wrote him an email, and I said, or maybe I wrote the email.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was either going to accept being godfather or press charges for stalking. It all hung out. It was a drama. Were they going to go to jail, ladies and gentlemen, or were they going to have a new godfather?
Dun, 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 godfather. Yeah, no, it was I thought to myself, well, the worst he can say is no.
Yeah, right.
And that was
I was happy, and I was happy. I would have to say that was one of my favorite Easters when you guys walked through the door.
It was so joyful and sweet. And Michael, your family like welcomed us, even though these were like probably weird strangers who had asked.
They acted like you had been there the whole time, right?
It was really special and sweet.
It was, and we continue. So let's back up even farther. Now, Katie is an associate professor of English at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan.
Yeah, south of Rochester, New York.
Meadowbrook Theater.
Meadowbrook Theater, yes.
Where they used to have a bluegrass festival there. I used to go to when I was a teenager. And I bet I saw Peter, Paul, and Mary there. I bet I saw them 4 times. And Pat Metheny, I think I saw there. But anyway, Katie teaches there, and now you have a kind of wonderful circuitous movement through school. I mean, you met John in college, right? In the University of Cincinnati, right?
Yeah, I entered the University of Cincinnati as a classics major, and
do they still have a classics program?
They still do. In fact, Cincinnati is one of the best ones.
Wow, awesome.
You go to college, you're a freshman, you don't know. You don't know that like these people are like world renowned in their field. So I think I only got to appreciate what I had after I'd left for a couple of years. I kind of better realized like who I had studied with. And but I eventually started taking creative writing classes. I had always been trying to write poetry. And then I started taking that more seriously. And the classics major then kind of shifted into a English major with creative writing and a classics minor. But Jonathan and I met in English classes. And
the 2 smartest kids in the class.
Well, we were competitors. And Professor Jonathan Kamholtz was our professor. And he used to, if someone said something smart, he would write it on the board. Just to kind of that like spurred us. We were like,
my name would never be on such a blackboard. But I think you two were, yeah.
Well, it was very good because he kind of spurred us on to say good things, in class. Like, oh, we had our words written on the board.
That's so interesting and cool.
It was cool, and
never heard of that before.
It's something I try to do too. If I have whiteboards now, and they're usually covered by the enormous screen, but sometimes I still write things on the board, and I think it makes the students feel really special and like, oh, I said that. That means something.
I may have to start using that.
Yeah. But we were competitors, and I did not like him at first. I thought he was kind of arrogant and a jerk.
Then you watched Wings of Desire. He was on for our show on Wings of Desire. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So, but we came around eventually, and that was a fun romp.
He toned it down eventually.
He did. Well, I don't know if he did that or I got used to it or
something. Hi, Katie. How are you? Did you see the Yankees game last week?
And then so then you went from Chicago, from Cincinnati, you went to Chicago.
First I went to Ann Arbor, where I did my MFA in poetry.
Okay.
at the same time, John went to Chicago and started working on a degree at U Chicago.
Right.
And then I did go to Chicago, and I worked at the Poetry Foundation for a while, which was great in a lot of ways.
What do you do at the Poetry Foundation?
I started off, I had a temp gig I had one of the worst temp jobs. Well, I don't want to say one of the worst. There's probably far worse, but this was a pretty bad one. I was a temp at a storage facility at O'Hare, your airport, where you couldn't even take the blue line, because like there was no public transit. There wasn't anything to connect the airport itself with where I had to go. And we specialized in really weird storage things, cadavers, for example, like bodies that had to be flown back internationally. So I was in this like windowless temp job with this terrible boss whose name was Henry Miller. And I remember thinking, like, the real Henry Miller would hate you so much.
Would he though, Katie? That's for another time. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, he was a doltish person.
Yeah. Okay.
Very not.
He would be so bored by him.
He'd be bored is probably.
That is a really interesting temp job, though. The way you described it. I was thinking, she works in a factory. No, this is pretty interesting. Yeah.
I couldn't wait to leave. And I got a phone call from a friend saying the Poetry Foundation needs someone to make photocopies for a day.
That's a win.
And I was like, I'm there. I'm there. And then I just kept saying, what else can I do? And they kept me around, and it became an internship, and then it became a full-time job. So
nice. I didn't know that.
It's kind of like that, Michael, that director or the movie guy, and I'm forgetting his name, and he was excellent, who kind of got a gig working with Terrence Malick that way. He just kind of showed up on set, then he just hung around for a while.
No, it was Reno.
Yeah, Reno Laura. That was great. Yeah. Similar.
Yeah, you hang around, you're like, what else can I photocopy?
Yeah.
Very cool. Now, Joe Parisi wasn't there anymore, was he?
He had just left. Chris Wyman had just taken over for him. So yeah, I got to know Chris and Danielle, and eventually their girls as time went on. And
so these names are foreign to me. These are all people. This is all an entity that produces the magazine Poetry or the journal Poetry.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and Chris Wyman was like now,
and they run the website, and
2 editors ago. So, but he was the new editor at the time, and he's he's a beautiful poet. He writes about faith beautifully, and questions, and he's had. I highly recommend his books to any listeners of his poetry and his prose. Beautiful.
So, and then you went from there back to Ann Arbor, right?
Well, so so after the Poetry Foundation, I went to Northwestern and got a PhD in comparative literature.
I thought it was at U of M.
No, that was at Northwestern. And so I worked between the classics department and the English department and the complet, and I did this kind of very sprawling dissertation, thinking about how poets have always been retelling stories, and especially from a female perspective. And I compared how contemporary female poets and ancient male poets use the female perspective to tell new versions of myth. So that was the dissertation. And then I got the job at Oakland because by then I had the first book coming out, and I had the dissertation, and I got the job at Oakland, and I was pregnant with Harlan. So it was a very big year. It was a very big.
And that's Oakland, Michigan.
Yeah, Oakland University in Michigan. Yeah, everyone always thinks, California.
They do.
I say, no. Michigan. Yeah.
Yeah. So well, that's a story. And that was a year. How about that for a year, right?
Yeah.
And at the time,
crazy ass job in an airport.
What year was it you moved to Ferndale?
We moved to Ferndale in the fall of 2016.
2016. So yeah, Mary Grove College was still more or less open, that's only about 6 miles away from Mary Grove College, where you were.
Right.
That's what they call BMC, before Mary Grove closing.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's
a timeline. Yeah.
Before they, don't get me good. But
we got to study Michael's literature and books before Mary Grove closing.
Before they screwed up.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, and I have never asked you this question, and I'm glad to ask you right now. How did you become a poet?
Oh, I think I had, Michael, in your book, there's a line that says, it says, if you have one kind of mother, this will happen to you. But then if you have the right kind of mother, you'll become a poet. Yeah. And I always remember that line because I think my family, like my mother, yes, but also her father, my grandfather, there was just a real love of language and songs. Especially my grandfather was always singing songs. My mother was always singing songs and playing with language and telling stories. My dad also was kind of an amateur poet. And I think one of the first poems I memorized was one that he had written when he was like in high school, because he would show me that stuff. And so, yeah, I just kind of grew up thinking that the best thing to be would be a poet. And that's,
Because it's true.
yeah, I had a poem in Highlights magazine when I was like
Really?
6
You can
or
read them.
Great.
something.
Wow.
Yeah, I think it was called Werewolves Don't Go to Summer Camp.
I hope you still have it someplace.
You know, probably somewhere in
In a
a
box.
file in my mother's
Yeah.
house exists. I don't know where it is now, but
We could get it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame next to like somebody's napkins, scribbled with the lyrics to the next top 40 hit.
yes, yes.
Well, so that's what led you into. I mean, I kind of grew up with this idea too. I think I'm a poet. I had no idea what
Yeah.
that. It just
No, it was really like, I think that's what I am.
Yeah.
And it was, and even when I was reading poetry that I think I was trying to read above my level in high school, or maybe I hadn't been given the tools to read advanced poetry. And even if I didn't understand it, I was still like, this is important. I don't know what it says, but this is important.
You can tell it's yeah, me too. I mean, that's it, right? I mean, you have to. I mean, at that age, you have to aim high.
Yeah.
And as a teacher, I mean, people always say, teach to the middle, and then no, teach to the top, and then everybody goes up.
Yeah, and
So,
I had great teachers in high school too, and I had a really cool English teacher. Her name was Miss Sol, SOL, and she always joked with our acronym humor going on here. She always joked it stood for shit out of luck. But she was like a real kind of gothic beauty in the middle of suburban Boardman, Ohio. She had this like raven long black hair and very like moody, beautiful person. And I should really try and find her. I'm sure she's still around somewhere, if not Boardman, Ohio. So
so how did that your journey is coming into growing up writing poetry? How did that happen?
probably more teachers, because I had I loved Latin in high school. And so I went to Cincinnati because I had this really wonderful classic scholarship. And then I started taking creative writing classes, and took a class with Jim Cummins, who's a wonderful poet, and became like my poetry mentor, father, figure in poetry, kind of a thing. And there were other great poets there too, Don Bogan, John Drury. I got to study with amazing people when I was an undergrad because they let me take graduate level workshops when they were visiting poets. So I got to study with C.D. Wright, which was one of like the foundational experiences. I adore C.D. Wright, and she and we used to have these wild, I mean, so I say poetry, but also like wine, because the Cincinnati, and they probably don't do this anymore. When visiting poets would come, they would have these receptions, and it was open bar, and my undergrad friends and I would just go, and we would get to drink wine with like Robert Hass, C.D. Wright, Linda Gregerson. It was really special. And it was,
when I was an undergrad, if I heard you have that experience, I wouldn't have even known that it could be fun, how it could be fun, or anything. So it's not like I just didn't have the opportunity. I didn't even have the wherewithal. If you told me that story, I would have fallen asleep. Right? Yeah, and back at that age,
Yeah.
I would have. Yep, interesting. Yeah.
But these poets would come. I
Right.
remember especially like when Bob Hass came, he had this kind of like glow around him, and I was like, that might be like the poet glow or something. And I just remember when I got to be in the room with him afterwards and hear people talking to him and see how people talked to him, with this kind of like awe, I was like, wow, that's something. Like, not that I wanted the awe, but like it reflected what he wrote, I guess, and like the things he was saying during the reading. Yeah. So really my time at Cincinnati was when you were asking Michael about what pivoted to me towards like the grown-up world of creative writing, that was huge. And then I took a year off, and then I went to my MFA programs. And I think it was also good to have a year off between undergrad and the MFA.
I think you wanted to get back to handling cadavers in
I
airports.
did.
Thought.
I never handled them.
Kind
I
of
did the paperwork,
Oh,
but
okay.
yeah.
I have a son who handles cadavers, but that's a different story.
I have a cousin who, for her job for a while, was to take the eyeballs out of cadavers for research. So
That's great.
travels with her special spoon, I guess.
I hope that shows up in a poem.
Yeah, maybe. I haven't
This
yet.
special, this special spoon.
So
Mhm.
Watch out for your soup.
So that's what a cool story.
Yeah,
And
it
I
really
think,
is. It really is.
you know, I look back and I think, well, actually, somebody you wrote about in your dissertation, you know, when I met her, it had an impression on me too. It's Rita Dove. And you'd be happy to hear that recently a student came out to me out of no place, talking about Rita Dove. I was like, what?
Thank God.
Yeah, college junior talking about Rita Dove. You read it in class, and they sure they hadn't read it in class. I don't know where she bumped into, but they told her about.
Yeah.
Let me ask you guys the name of a poet that I didn't know, but I was in Washington kind of stalking an author, this Irish monk, Mark Patrick Hederman, who I mentioned in our correspondence with our guest, Mr. Tunney, Mike. But I went to Washington, and my friend who's a Trappist monk and a poet, Father Isaac Slater, he and I spent a day with the poet Fanny Howe. Is that a name you know? She was wacky. She was great.
Fanny Howe. She's amazing.
Yeah. So we went to the National Gallery of Art. Father Isaac, the monk, and his Trappist, he was just driving around town like a crazy man. She was just scared in this car in Washington, D.C. as we're going through Georgetown at 60 miles an hour with this mad monk poet. And I learned a lot about poetry that day. We watched the pandas and the zoo and everything, but it was all with Fanny Howe that then I started reading some of her poetry. Yeah.
Oh, I'm jealous.
It's really fun,
To spend a day with a monk and Fanny Howe.
Yeah, right from a morning through a really nice dinner in Georgetown. About 12 hours.
Yeah. And so you should also read The Wedding Dress and The Winter Sun. Those are her essay collections. Amazing. They're like gorgeous. Her
the philosopher Richard Carney was there too. He's a really interesting.
Her parents were into like modernist theater and New Yeats and stuff, I think. And her sister is Susan Howe, who is a scholar and wrote one of the best books on Emily Dickinson called My Emily Dickinson. And they're amazing. And then there's more poets in that family. But I love Fanny Howe. Her recent book is Love and I think that's the title. John got it for me for my birthday, actually.
Her friend, you might like his poetry, but the monk, his name when he writes books of poetry is John Slater.
John Slater.
Well, he's got the same issue, the first imagination.
Yeah, he's got, that's right. In the first Jesus Imagination.
Maybe two. No, well, something like that.
Yeah, John Slater.
And then I just want to show our peoples. There's Katie's first book, Better Than Pink, which came out in 2018.
It came out in 2016.
2016.
And it was December 2016. And Harlan came out in February 2017. And I did not have any I didn't get to go and do a lot of readings for that book or I was like very subsumed with the precious end of pregnancy and the precious newborn days. So now that I've been doing some readings for Wolf Trees, I think back and I think about the kind of closed world of like that book.
Wolf Trees.
Go on, get those right now. So before we talk more shop, why don't you read another poem?
Sure.
Maybe you could read Studies in Devotion.
Sure.
And what page is it on? I want to read along.
Studies in Devotion is
page 12.
On page
12. Thank you.
And I think we'll follow this up with Michael has a really interesting connection to this poem. But I'll just say before I read it that It is partially ekphrastic of Raphael's Madonna di Foligno. So a large, some part of the poem describes that painting, and this comes out of a time in my life, and also out of mine and Jonathan's lives, where we had some losses and we were praying for children. So that's kind of the outward context of this poem. So, studies in devotion. He reaches for my insulin pump, the size of a strawberry, underneath my sleeve. He thinks it's me, the programmed opaque reservoir that feeds my blood in drips. Expecting it to yield like skin to his touch, he outlines the hard edges until enough is known for now. We slip into the pose of mother, we shift, into the pose of mother and slippery child in Raphael's Madonna di Foligno, the painting a doctor prescribed to me. Not for Jerome or his lion, not for Francis's hands, like winter branches singing to faraway shapes, not for John the Baptist, his Rod Stewart hair and wiry biceps, and not for the woman or the babe who squirms to sail out of her arms. My doctor, she was very good, directed my gaze to the children's faces surrounding Mary. They have become the clouds they float inside. Some look at her and some look at each other. Some have been reading James Wright and cup their sister's cheeks. They ripple tensely. They can hardly contain their happiness. Others prefer Leonard Cohen. They are leaning out for love, and they will lean that way forever. Look at them for a long time, a little each day, my doctor instructed, and I did, holding a screen in my lap in a Chicago flat. The man who commissioned the work kneels below them, caped in fur-lined red. Something fiery fell from the sky and into his house, but he lived. Paint me alone among the saints. Paint me in my gratitude. This happened years ago. On earth they gather around the ground torn open by the disaster, a womb of nothingness that filled, healed shut, and now these green and yellow tufts grow there, as if dormant seeds were harrowed back to life. And in the middle, across his messenger's chest, a cherub holds a blank bronze plaque, still waiting for its words, the way the uninscribed can wait.
Beautiful, beautiful. And some of you might not know, but there's a quote from James Wright's, one of my favorite poems, James Wright's poem, A Blessing, which is one of the extraordinary poem. But here's the story, though. So when I was going through the poems after Katie gave me the book a few weeks ago, I don't even think I was reading in order. I think I read Breast Milk, and then I just picked up the book and I see Madonna del Foligno. I'm like, okay, I'll read that one. And so I read it, and it got to the part where it says, the painting a doctor prescribed to me. And that might sound like poetic license, that like a doctor is prescribing a painting to a patient. But I knew what it was because I know the doctor. It was crazy. Because when I was a Waldorf teacher, I was there. So another person we've had on the show, Mary Jo Oresti, who is my oldest son's Dylan's godmother. In fact, it's his birthday today, and her birthday tomorrow.
Happy birthday to Dylan.
Happy birthday.
Right. And happy birthday, Mary Jo.
Mary Jo tomorrow.
And so when I first was learning to be a Waldorf teacher, a lot of things they had me do is I would go work with Mary Jo. She did kind of Waldorf curative education, for kids with learning disabilities or whatever, or who weren't quite in their bodies yet. And they had just come up with this treatment, I guess we could call it. They called it the Madonna treatment, where they would show, and the full-blown one is they would have a sequence of images from mostly Raphael's Madonnas, and they would also project onto the image the Madonna, so you get like a almost a three-dimensional experience of it while playing the lyre. And last December, after my mother died, Mary Jo came over and she said, Michael, we should do the Madonna treatment for you and the kids. And so she came over, she did it. And I knew, and we had done it, I did it with her 30 years ago. And here I'm reading about the Madonna treatment in here. And I knew it was the doctor because the doctors two of them who brought this to the States were Ross and Andrea Rentea from Chicago. So I called Katie up right away. I said, girl, where'd this come from? This is Andrea Rentea, right?
Yep.
And lo and
Well,
behold,
no, at first you said like,
Crazy.
what doctor are you talking about? I said, oh, Dr. Andrea and like then you finished my sentence. Because when I lived in Chicago, I found my way to her. And again, this was long before I met Michael. So it's just a way that like our paths were crossing before they even crossed.
Crazy story. Yeah.
And I saw her for several things. She's a wonderful anthroposophic doctor. And yeah, in that time of my life, like the poem starts out, with a child. The poem isn't clear if it's the speaker's child or someone else's. So I think the poem wants to kind of shift through different times and desires. But one of the things I struggled with like in pregnancy and was my diabetes. I have type 1 diabetes, and the book is a lot about that. So it starts out with that moment, but then it goes into the doctor saying, you're prescribing to me this Madonna di Foligno. And I think I don't say it directly in the poem that the reason is, praying for children, and, hoping for a healthy pregnancy, which she was also giving me some sun hormones for. But yeah, that is what it was for. And it's amazing. And when Michael said, I know that doctor, I was just kind of blown away, because I also was very pleased with it as a poetic phrase, Michael, the painting a doctor prescribed to me, but she did.
No, it's a great poetic phrase. When the story began, I thought maybe you were kind of capturing Michael as a doctor, that he prescribed that picture. I'm like, this is gonna be crazy. Yeah, but I love the idea. This lady has to take the Madonna treatment on the road, don't you think? And I don't mean that in a commercialized way, but that type of it's intuitively true. Okay, so a lot of people would just get it right away. Even if they thought a lot of this stuff was crazy, it makes a lot of sense.
Contemplate those images, and something happens. Something happens.
Yeah. In fact, I'd stand up.
We should copyright it, Mike. Steal it. Try and make some money for the Regeneration podcast. Also, the lines from Leonard Cohen in that poem, Katie, from Suzanne. Yes. I argue that that's Michael. If we ever had a show on the most sophiological songs ever, Leonard Cohen's Suzanne is the most sophiological song ever written.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the song brings me to tears.
Yeah, it's wild. It's his best.
I just love. Have you heard Nina Simone sing it?
Yeah.
Oh,
haunting.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that version too.
And your line, Katie, the winter branches singing to faraway shapes. I think that's my favorite.
Oh, thank you.
Winter branches singing to faraway shapes. I just thought that was so beautiful.
It's so much beautiful. And well, here's the thing. I mean, I reread the book again today, preparing for this evening, and there's this theme of diabetes that comes through it, but it stands against the other theme, which is motherhood, right? And breast milk and all and the anxieties about fearing you won't be able to get pregnant and dealing with miscarriage, and which is what part of what this poem alludes to, right? And I think it's beautiful because it's I don't want to say vulnerable because it's such a hackneyed phrase sometimes, but there's such a vulnerability to it, and there's such an honesty to it, and it's so rare for me to encounter this this valorization of the feminine and of motherhood in poetry. And it's I can't wait to make Bonnie read it.
You would think it would be the central image in all of poetry. See, I don't read that much poetry. Well, to an outsider, if I was playing Family Feud and they said central images in poetry, I'd probably I'd say like tree definitely, and mother and child would be number 2. Yep.
And it's just beautiful. And plus no, I mean, and I told you before, when I read your poems, I hear them in your voice.
Oh, thank you. And I think you're not wrong to say vulnerable. it's good. I think, I'm always thinking about roots, and vulnus is Latin for wound.
Yeah.
And, woundable, like the things that can pierce us. And I think the poetry is always really open and alive to that. So, yeah.
Which is so extraordinary poem. So much in there, so much. So what? I mean, I don't know if this is even worth asking, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Uh, what is it that you think that that drove you or inspired you to move in this direction of talking about your diabetes and motherhood here?
When I was diagnosed, it was a late onset diagnosis, and I had seen some of my family members struggle with diabetes. My maternal grandfather and one of my maternal first cousins, who was diagnosed when she was 12. And it was just such a huge life change. I mean, it's still hard to articulate like how many times of the day I'm thinking about my diabetes. It's really like, well, I'm going to take this walk. So do I need to take a snack? What's my blood sugar now? How much insulin do I take? And there's so much advanced technology that helps me with all of that. Like, I'm so grateful for it to be alive at a time, like, to think of, just over a century ago, it would have been a death sentence, period. And it's a really
I was going to ask that question. Wild. Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's very old. I mean, ancient Greeks knew it. The Egyptians knew it. The Egyptians actually have some wild, because I tried to do a lot of reading, around, but it appears in one of the oldest Egyptian medical texts. And they have this wild recipe for trying to cure it, which involves like hops and water from the bird pond. And it's really, actually, it's a poetic list all on its own, like the list to cure diabetes. But so it's really old, and it's been, ravaging bodies for a long time. And certainly in the 20th century in American context, type 2 diabetes is a little bit different, but that's kind of a different story. So it was just such a huge shift in my consciousness and I think when I was writing poems, I thought there was always a part of me that was like, well, put that away. Like, the diabetes doesn't belong in the poems. Like, when you write poems, it will be about other, better, or not like, necessarily optimistic things, but like easier things or less granular, like medical things. But then as I was trying to get pregnant and as I experienced miscarriage, I knew that the diabetes was part of being the best diabetic I could be, was going to be part of being the best pregnant mother I could be, because it's actually really an intense experience, because you and the baby share blood. And so if your blood sugar is high, the baby's blood sugar is high, and that can lead to problems for the child and the fetus. And so being pregnant as a diabetic is exceptionally stressful, and stress, guess what, can raise your blood sugar. So it's just an intense experience. And I don't know if you've seen Steel Magnolias with Julia Roberts. There's like, I think for a long time, and Sally Field, like Julia Roberts is a type 1 diabetic in that movie. And I think for a long time for diabetic moms, it was like a cautionary tale, like, no, pregnancies aren't good, for diabetic mothers. And it's just been in the past, I think, few decades that care has become advanced enough that, you can do it safely, but it's really, you have to focus on it all the time. It has to be a constant priority. And when I had Harlan, and then when I had Arthur, and I was starting to write about it, I think it was just because it just took so much of my attention and heart that it had to come out in a poem. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how to make it come out in a poem. I didn't know how to approach writing about something that felt not very capital P poetic. And then, my father-in-law was visiting one day, and he pointed at a tree in our neighborhood that's clearly one of the oldest trees in the neighborhood, and had been there long before the neighborhood was a neighborhood, when it was still farmland. And he said, "Oh, that's a wolf tree." And I said, "What is a wolf tree?" And it's not a super common phrase, but it is more common than you might think. Like, there's, usage of it across the country. And it's either a tree that was not cut down when the rest of the forest was cut down to make way for farmland, and it was set aside as kind of a shade tree, for the animals grazing. Or that tree, then the farms failed and a new woodland grew up around it. And so it's the oldest tree in a younger forest. Either way, it's, I guess how I came to it was that it was a remnant of a former ecology. Like it's like a landmark of the past. And I guess thinking of myself as someone who survives with a disease that would have killed them like 100 years ago, something in that connected me with the wolf tree. And then when I started writing about wolf trees, that's when the diabetes started. The writing about the diabetes started coming out, but it was also totally involved with my becoming a mother. And I think the idea of the wolf tree is there's something that's really good for the forest. Like the health of the forest is not kind of what was an earlier forestry idea of like maintenance and cutting down the old trees and sweeping it out and only having a clean, tidy forest. And you need mess. You need like the old rotting wolf trees because you need like all the generative minerals and the places for animals to live. And so there's something maternal about a wolf tree that wrapped up in that. So
yeah, I guess I said that there's a long wolf tree sequence in here, which is just beautiful, beautiful. Would you like to read one of those?
well, I could pick one to read. So they alternate lineated like free verse. It is mostly free verse or prose poems. The last one is actually in blank verse tercets. I was having a really hard time with the last section, and then I started thinking, well, I'm gonna write it in a loose blank verse and make it tercets, and then it came together all of a sudden. So I could read, I don't get to read section 8 very much. So maybe I'll read that actually, because it ends with a joke. And I listed my family earlier who had diabetes. I didn't mention my paternal grandmother also had it. So it's on both sides of my family. Section 8 talks about my neighborhood, but also conversations with my grandmother when I was pregnant, and then experiences she had in her job as a maternity ward nurse for many years. And then it ends with a joke she told me. So yeah, okay, so I'll read section 8, and it's on page 37 of the book. You're a little long in the tooth to be having a baby, my grandmother chuckled at me. Wolf trees don't have teeth anymore. In fact, their gummy, open gullets are more like wombs. The sparrows know something like this, they who built a nest in the growling mouth of the dragon statue down the street, flying freely in and out. She grew up in the Depression and usually does not laugh at her own jokes. Like a wolf tree, her face is the craggiest kind of beautiful. An old diabetic, she'd call herself, with some bitterness. She is not many years away from becoming a snag, a decayed and hollow trunk all the conservation biologists are now likewise advising don't cut down. Precisely because they're dead, they shelter life. I don't think she was being mean. I think she likes saying things other people don't, to preserve certain turns of phrase, long in the tooth, or I won't have no truck with so-and-so. I think she was worried. Head nurse of the maternity ward for decades, she once delivered 10 babies in one night. Once, a 15-pound baby. The mother was an old diabetic, she said, laying every ounce of blame on the body she had seen inside. And the baby? Not good to look at. I think for all her worries, she likes the spirit of a good surprise, like her remark once that Sean Connery probably has plenty of good sperm left. Another virtue of the wolf tree, in their old age and breadth, they are prolific seed producers. Or, like a watermelon roast, hearing that I attended a bonfire on a beach with a group of friends, she asked if we had a watermelon roast. What's that? Oh, it's when guys and girls have a fire and someone throws a watermelon in and it explodes and everybody goes into the bushes and has a piece.
Really
Grandma.
That was my grandma. That was my baba.
good. Grandma Salty.
She was the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. She just passed in 2021.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Um, so I think I'd mostly finished the book, but yeah, she was a wonder.
Sounds great. It's wonderful. Oh, so now once upon a time we talked. In fact, Katie was here with the boys for Michaelmas, and she heard that Dylan was studying the Iliad in school. And she gave him a mini course right there in the barn on the Iliad, and he was blown away. He was stoked. And my son,
That's great.
14. Um, but Katie has been working on a translation of the Iliad,
I have.
and that's been it's a long-term project because it has to be, right?
Yeah, it's changed in a lot of ways. And now it's part translation and then part creative commentary and part vignettes of ancient audience members. So what the structure will roughly look like is I'll have a section of a translation of the Iliad, and then I'll have a little sort of lyric prose piece, sort of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. I kind of want them to have that kind of vibe. Where I imagine an ancient person experiencing and thinking about the Iliad in antiquity. So mostly archaic age, I'm thinking, like kind of pre-literacy, pre books and writing. So yeah. So I love the Iliad. It's one of my favorite things. You know, I think I was one of those kids who grew up thinking the Odyssey was so cool and fun, and like that was kind of my favorite one, and I didn't really think much about the Iliad. And then when I started reading it in Greek and during my PhD program with another amazing mentor of my life, Marianne Hopman, a wonderful classicist and not a poet, but I think she made my brain a better poet brain just by studying with her. Because she had so many insights to the Greek and into metaphor, and just she's amazing. But now the Iliad is my favorite thing. Obviously, I still love the Odyssey, but the Iliad is, I don't know, I think it's like my lifelong obsession. So
And everything about this book was your idea, Katie?
The current project, like is
Okay,
my,
yeah, it's great.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, because I think I don't want it to be just a regular translation, because there have been several of those out lately, especially by women, which is very cool. So I think just even sort of thinking about publication wise, like I didn't want it to be, well, here's another translation, of the Iliad. It'll be a little bit different. It'll be more of an invitation, even though that's another word that gets overused, I think, Michael. But it'll be more of like an invitation into the Iliad and maybe its ancient contexts. That's what I hope.
So why the Iliad?
Because I think there's just so much humanity in the Iliad, so much beauty. The epic similes are some of my favorite things in the world. How they show us glimpses of a peaceful agrarian world, like reflected through the lens of war, and the speeches, the characters, the poetry. I mean, it's just, I feel like there's like, sometimes there's just 3 words in the Iliad I just like spend time staring at and thinking about. It's just, and the original experience of it would have been so different. They would never have experienced in the archaic age. There wouldn't have been a 3-day long performance of the Iliad. They would have heard short episodes at a time. And I think when students sit down with like this whole book by themselves and think of it, reading it all by themselves, it's so alien from how its origins. And so I kind of want to bring people back into like an episodic community of hearing it.
Nice. In fact, this is not, well, it's kind of related, not related, but I often show students, there's from Star Trek: The Next Generation, when Captain Picard tells the story of Gilgamesh. It's only about a 3-minute scene, but it is packed with meaning and humanity, just because, that's where it's all at. It's the story. And I think I might be wrong, but you may have been talking with Gabriel about the scene when Hector comes back home,
Yes.
which
Looks
is
like,
one of
yeah.
my favorite scenes in all of literature.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
one of the only one of the glimpses we get of like a happy family where the husband and wife clearly love and respect each other. And the way they talk to each other is just so persuasive and compelling and heartbreaking because everyone knows how it will end.
yeah,
And yeah.
everybody knows how it's going to end.
Yeah.
No,
Mike, are
and
you an Iliad or an Odyssey guy?
me?
I no,
Yeah.
really the only familiarity, I've never read it, but I was thinking, but it would just sound like trying to butt in because I really don't know that much, but it would be Simone Weil's essay on Iliad, and the power of force. And
Yes.
it's funny because that essay I've read several times, probably not for the last 15 years, but it's not helping me even remember, there's not too much I can, but I remember being blown away by that essay.
Yeah. Well, even Greek, unwilling, is such a word that reoccurs in the Iliad, and the idea that like this is happening by force,
Yeah.
So that's a great essay. If you want to go to the Iliad, I recommend Carolyn Alexander's translation.
Okay.
It came out in 2016. My favorite of all time is Richmond Lattimore's from like the mid 20th century because it's very.
Okay.
This might be again another overused word, but it's very stately. It's like it's very, I don't know, I love it. But students, it's not as accessible to students as I think Carolyn Alexander still keeps the poetry and the rhythm, but it's just a little bit more easy for them to read.
Great information.
Yeah. Well, it's weird with translations. I mean, you always think the best one's the first one you fell in love with, which is usually the first one you read, right? Exactly. And then you read other ones, so it's not the same.
Never the same. I know. It's like that scene in Annie Hall when he tries to recreate the lobster date. Yep. And he's like, it never works out the same as it did with Annie. And I'm that way with Konstantin Cavafy and Ray Dalvin. Like that's my favorite translation of Cavafy. But John's favorite is Keely and Sherrard. And so we like argue about it. But that's because it's the first one we read.
I know
Yeah.
I know what that's like. I mean, I think the first Rilke translation I read was probably Stephen Mitchell's. Stephen Spender did one, and I went to read that. I was like, wow, this is lame. But
yeah, right?
Probably not. But other people are like, this is the best one.
Yeah, the Germans would be a good example of that for me, how it's definitely the first one I read. I just can't be moved into another one. It's a whole world each time. And interesting. I'm going to want you to read Negative at some point because you said you have things to say about it too, Katie.
So why don't we do that now?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So one of the nice things about the pandemic was how many walks we took as a family. And we were just out all the time, walking through woods, changing diapers. It was a lot of outside time, and that was one of the best parts about it for us. And so one of our favorite places to walk in Ann Arbor is Barton Pond, and by the dam, and there's a little bridge over the river, and it gets graffitied, and so we would walk by, and someone had graffitied in blue cursive, very beautiful blue cursive, the word sea, S-E-A. So, and it was right when you were looking over the Huron, and it's very Midwestern, deciduous, like brown, green, like there's nothing maritime about it. But there was something so beautiful about seeing the word sea in blue over the Huron. And it just felt like, oh, I live at a place where poets live or something like that. Like I loved looking at that and seeing that word on the bridge. And so that was one of my favorite things. And then there was a point in the pandemic when everyone was getting really tired and frustrated. Like, what is going on? This is awful. And on one of those days, I walked on that bridge and someone had come along and crossed out the word sea. Oh. And I like screamed. I was so upset because it was like.
And you say uncannily equal to the word it came to cancel is the line from the poem that I like best. Oh, uncannily, this X. It's never been a better use of uncanny, uncannily equal to the word it came to cancel. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
But that was something the poem brought me to, like thinking about it that way. But yeah, I'll read it. So that's this is on page 9. Negative. To whoever crossed out with a blue X the word sea, written in white cursive on the top iron guardrail of my second favorite bridge over the Huron River. Of course it's not. Were you angry? Were you sad? Are you a disgruntled former employee of the earth? You have company. I know some walks can get you nowhere. I've seen one child take away a toy from another, not because they wanted the lamb or train or drum, but they saw the other kid so happy with it. And a no erupts, a need to negate what might be someone's favorite thing. When I first saw what you did, I yelled across the water, startling swans with their bottoms up through air and beaks deep in dioxane-plumed mud back to the surface. Their hearts can't say what's been done to them either. And why did you use such a pastel Marian shade of blue? Why does your ex have that strange sense of elegance, patience, uncannily equal to the word it came to cancel? Almost as if it were you who first wrote sea in a burst of jubilant heresy, a fit of 21st century Duchampian reverence, a mood where the world could be different, when water itself could be baptized, revised. Then came a day terribly certain that no better difference is coming, a day to recant, not erase your work, a day like today. I feel it too.
Really great. And Michael too. I thought Katie, one time I think Michael came up, we have all these church wars. We're always talking about the church wars on this podcast, and
Yes.
rad treads and everything. But I'm always interested in like the way the word holiness is used, but the other one is the way the word reverence is used. And I remember, because reverence can mean just throwing up a lot of mystic mumbo jumbo. And everyone goes, I want that in liturgy, that's reverent. But Michael, you described reverence one time on the podcast saying, like, each year when you read the story, it was on Michaelmas, but you read the story of St. Francis of Assisi, and it was this tradition, and seeing the look in people's eyes. But you write, Katie, reverence, a mood where the world could be different, when water itself could be baptized, revised. And again, somebody who had some poetic sensibilities. In some song by Peter Gabriel, he talks about the washing of the water. But you're saying the water that could be, water itself could be baptized. That's very evocative of reverence, and I have to sit with that for a long time. What did it capture for you? What were you saying there?
Well, I guess the idea that the initial vision of writing sea over the brown, well, the dark waters of the Huron, was like, I can reimagine this. I can recast this, and this water maybe has the soul of water, so from somewhere far away or long ago. It just felt like such an imaginative recasting.
Yeah.
And I think something about that reverence of like transformation, possibility, something about that speaks to reverence.
Yeah. I was also reading, people don't know, a lot of people who haven't seen the Great Lakes. So you're talking about the Huron River. Probably doesn't look like the Mediterranean. But on the other hand, Lake Huron at the north, where it meets the Mackinac, right? That people are amazed at that water. They don't know that it looks like the Mediterranean, the water around, Mackinac Island. So both Hurons were kind of playing with me. And when I saw the word sea, I saw the blue of Lake Huron from like St. Ignace or something. And, it was evocative in that way. And then when I thought of, water being baptized, I thought of the Mediterranean kind of waters and things.
No, let me shift a little bit to process. So, I mean, because I'm hoping that maybe some students or younger people, or my daughter Zelly, will watch this and want to know what's your kind of process in writing poetry? How does it happen? Because I know my experience, but I'm just what's it like for you?
It's really a gift. I mean, and not that I have the gift. It's something that comes like a gift comes, and like a phrase will appear, or something will stir me, and I need to write it down, and then eventually the poem builds up around that. Like I rarely sit down thinking like I'm going to write a poem about this. Because I feel like that doesn't make good poems, I don't think, when you have a topic. But no, it's an image. It's a visual clash of some kind of something I see and something I think, and then I have to write it down. And some poems take a long time, like over many, many revisions. I just had a poem that was, so when before we would have met you in 2016, Jonathan and I took a trip to Ireland, and I had a poem written about a graveyard we visited in Carrigaholt. And I just revised that poem again, like this year. So some poems like go and sit for a while, and then, you know, come back with like I choose a different form or a different approach to how to revise it, and then something new comes out of that. So, but what starts it? I mean, it always has felt like a little bit of something coming to me from beyond. And I was just reading Lucille Clifton is a poet I love, and Ross Gay wrote the foreword to her recently published collection, The Light. And he wrote about how so many people in creative writing try to talk about find your voice, find the voice that's all yours. Whereas Clifton, she too would talk about it as something like, it's not mine. I don't know why, but it comes to me and it's not mine. And so it's a really interesting distinction of, I don't feel like I own it in any way.
Now, didn't she die a couple of years ago?
She did, yeah.
Did you ever meet her?
You know, I did not get to meet her, sadly, but I got to be at a reading very shortly after her death that her family, her children, gave in Chicago, and that was really special. So,
Well, we had her come to Marygrove when I was teaching there, and
oh, really? That's
oh,
amazing.
she was funny, and she was talking about, because she was older, and she was talking about when she was giving a reading at some Catholic college, and she goes, and there I was talking to all these nuns about the spiritual life, and I told my daughter, shoot me before I kill again. She was a riot. She was a lovely human being.
I wish I could have met her. I mean, the stories I hear, yeah.
She was full of life, that woman.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite people we brought in. We brought in quite a few people.
Yeah.
Here's my question that's been bugging me lately about the writing of poetry, and I get poems sent to me to edit or something. What's the toughest part about writing poetry? Or maybe not, or finishing poetry, put it that way.
Maybe it's hoping people like it. Maybe that's something that you that you like have to not ultimately care about. Because I think another part of my process is like, it does feel like a way that I pray or that I praise, and that I'm trying to acknowledge and be grateful for some, divine love or some guiding force I feel over the world. And so if that's the service, if you're in service of something bigger, like poets can have egos, poets can really have egos. And so probably like maybe one of the toughest parts of writing poetry is like not having it attached to anything about yourself so much.
No. Here's the thing. Here's my question. It's totally so prosaic. What about punctuation? Isn't that the toughest thing about writing poetry? It is for me.
That's so funny. Do you like to be without it, or?
I don't know.
The existence of it.
You know what I mean? Sometimes, it's just, and
and grammar. I mean, Jonathan will be like, you read too much Latin. You write these long sentences and nobody wants to read them. Or when I was getting this book, when I was going through its revision, when it was getting proofread, the editor, one of the readers, who will rename, I don't know who it was. It's anonymous to me. My editor knows who they are. There's several instances where I use what's called, what was the phrase they used? They called it a needs washed phrase. So I guess it's very Appalachian, and I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which is at the tip, of Appalachia. And it's something that's very much in my language, like, like in a poem on page, let's see if I can find it. Page 11, like lake water wanting parted, or a barn that needed burning. Like there were several things where I'm using this like not correct syntax, and it should be like wants to be parted or needs to be burned, right? And it's I guess like someone has studied it and they called it the needs washed phrase, because that's like a way that they commonly saw it used in Appalachia. And the anonymous editor was like, we need to cut this out. Like, this is like subliterate. Like they actually use the phrase, like, it's not elegant. It's not poetic. It's not, it needs to go. And I had to fight like kind of hard for it. Like that, it's part of my language. It's part of like my brain thinks that way, and I don't want to cut it out, you know? So my editor eventually, after 3 rounds of email, my editor, who is amazing, Alex Pepple, God bless you, like you're amazing. But he eventually was like, okay, Katie, you can keep your subliterate.
It's a great story.
You can, who you calling subliterate? Yeah. It's interesting. Because I mean, it's kind of mysterious. The whole process of making poems is pretty mysterious.
Katie, a quick question though, is that you know, one of them, when they wade into the murky waters of Rudolf Steiner, right, or especially in the hands of Owen Barfield, that, and some of our listeners might be interested, and you can only say what you want to say, but like when I'm explaining to people the case for the evolution of consciousness, you know, quite often it would boil down to, again, in the hands of Owen Barfield, that for Homer, the muse was something outside, sees somebody, it felt completely other, and now the evolution is such that in a person of genius or in a poet, you know, the voice, the muse that's now in you, such it's where Katie is most I, Katie, but also something different. Mm-hmm. From your understanding of Greek and so forth, does that evolution of consciousness pass muster? Or does that say it misunderstands one, you know, the whole thing? Because it sounds pretty cool, right? But to a poet, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer is yes and no, because that is definitely the convention, and it's definitely a convention that I think is true. Like something bigger than you overtakes you, and you are in its thrall, and you are in its service in some way, and like inspiration, right? It breathes through.
And it might, early on, it might push out the personality.
Yeah. The thing I would add though, in terms of like an ancient Greek epic poetry context, is that those poets were training from a young age to memorize large swaths of poetry. So the convention goes that they can grow up and say, Muse, speak to me. I am your chosen one. Like, so I like, yes, you know the story, but I'm your chosen vessel. Mm-hmm. The pragmatic part of it, though, is that they would have been trained from a young age to memorize all of those poems, and they would have had the freedom to tweak and change different occasions, different strategies, different things they wanted to highlight. If they wanted to highlight a marriage, or if they wanted to highlight a funeral, maybe that would like change what they chose to say. So yes, there's the muse, but it's also intense training in such a way that maybe it still does do what you said, that it pushes out the personality, the ego, but it's not as if, you know, someone can be walking around, like, so Hesiod in the beginning of Theogony famously says, the muses came to me, I was a shepherd on the mountain, and they said, you know, will we pick you, you know, here's your laurel, here's your staff. And they also insult him. They say, shepherds, merest bellies. And then they say, interestingly, we know how to tell the truth, but we also know how to tell lies that sound true. So even the muses are very into casting suspicion upon themselves. But I would say that it's not the case that like someone like say in their 20s who has never recited epic poetry before could be overtaken by the muse and just start spewing epic. Like,
and I'm thinking of the Sibyls here or something, right? The ancient Sibyls,
no, it would have been
they would have
been working, practicing to memorize the equivalent of, you know, just enormous, what we now have as books, was all in their heads. And that's incredible. You know, that's just really something we can hardly imagine. But Seth Shine, who's an excellent classicist, now retired from UCLA, he said, like, the Iliad is one of the oldest poems we have, but it itself is the product of thousands of years of poetry and of poetic tradition. Like it's the culmination really of like so much training and shifting over time. So
I think what you're saying, I mean, it's, I know this from being a musician as well as being a poet. People think they can just, I've never read any poetry, but I'm a poet now and I'm writing poetry. And it's like, oh, isn't that charming? I mean, you wouldn't hand them a violin and say, let it rip.
right.
That's right. Who did we have on the show, Michael, who loved Amadeus? And I dislike the movie Amadeus for that reason. It makes it look like genius is easy. Who we had on?
I don't remember who there was.
Like the Mozart just wrote it all without working hard.
But even with Mozart, I mean, he trained from a very young age.
Right. That's my point. Yeah.
But I think, but I, so I've been playing music forever. And when I was 18, I was pretty precocious as a musician.
Surprised.
But these older guys would say, man, you're good, but you haven't paid your dues.
Yep.
And there's a big difference between how I was playing when I was 18 and even when I was 20, 24. There was a huge difference. I mean, you do have to go through a kind of training, even if it's not a formal training. You have to. I in fact, at my niece's wedding a couple months ago, I ran into my best friend growing up, and we wrote. I bet we wrote 200 songs together between the ages of 16 and 26, and we talked about it. It was, we wrote a lot of crappy songs, but it was an apprenticeship that we went through.
Yep.
And it really prepared me to be a poet.
We don't talk about it much, but in my line of work, you see the same thing. It's pastoring. I work with so many priests, I've worked with monks, but like the people who just with experience kind of get it, it is a work of art. The way they can enter a situation, understand what's going on, say the right thing. It's totally beautiful. And same thing, me when I was young, I thought I had it. And I was, oh my God, right. That we're saved from ourselves is the greatest gift we could ever get.
We develop a sense of intuition about it.
Yeah.
But it's through training. So it's an interesting thing. We got all this training, but if you rely on all the training, it's stiff. And there's something else that goes on where you have to let intuition or inspiration work as well, which is it. And you see this with jazz musicians all the time too, right?
Yeah.
But we're kind of we're getting long in the tooth here. So
long in the tooth.
Wrapping it up. Wrap it up. Why don't we have you read The Nipple Shield of Achilles? Speaking of breastfeeding and Greek literature.
Yeah, that would be great. So this is one of the last poems in the book, and it's on page 82. And to preface it, I would say that the poem talks about this, but if you're not familiar with the therapies of nursing, there is a little item called a nipple shield that lactation consultants will give mothers who are having a difficult time nursing. And I've taught the Iliad many times, and I love the scene where Hephaestus makes the shield of Achilles, and it's just gorgeous, and it's kind of this cosmic cycle of everything on the shield at once. And I also love Auden's poem, The Shield of Achilles, which has such a dark, upending of all the difficult beauty of the shield. So I think a lot about the Shield of Achilles. So when the lactation consultant gave me the nipple shield, I immediately was like, the nipple shield of Achilles. Like it just was in my head, like instantly, because it is such an odd phrase.
What does a nipple shield do?
Well, the poem.
My wife and I've had 4 babies. I'm trying to think.
Well, maybe she didn't need one. I had a terrible time, as the poem says, when I was starting to nurse. And so I guess so I thinks about that, and then it also thinks about the idea that Achilles' mother Thetis is immortal, and part of the beauty that I spoke of earlier, that the humanity of the Iliad comes through. I think that in antiquity, so many mothers, wives, sisters, daughters would have lost young men to war in various ways. And so even though Thetis is a goddess, her grief is so fresh because she hasn't yet had to experience mortality in a meaningful way. And so when she's thinking about losing her son, it's as if the oldest experience is made brand new and painful. And that is part of what I love thinking about ancient women, listening to Thetis grieve, that even though she's a goddess and they're human, that there's enormous reciprocity there. Yeah, I think then I'll read it. The nipple shield of Achilles. When Thetis mourns her son before he is dead, she says, I raised him like a tree in a sloping orchard. Or maybe I nourished him like a tree. Or fattened, cherished, gave strength to, gave suck to. I had a terrible time when I started nursing. Ravaged was the word my chest sang like an epic simile where a beaten donkey keeps destroying crops while the bloodshed rages on. Not only because of the baby's tongue tie it took 3 lactation consultants to notice, but also they all agreed because of his mother's nipples. My ex used to tease me. They were tiny, platitudes, not obelisks. He'd touch them, we'd tussle, I'd protest my greatness. I almost called him, hey, guess what I need? When I was given a small piece of silicone called a nipple shield. It protected my skin and gave the baby more bulk to suck. Where is the epic poem of childbirth? My friend Ruth has wondered, and just yesterday I heard Madeline Miller ask the same. To help myself heal, I also purchased breast shells, which sounded like something an ocean nymph might wear. Ah me, my sorrow, the bitterness in this best of childbearing. Thetis is, remember, immortal. I imagine her gliding onto the plain of war to say what no extant epic would have wanted her to say, put that down right now. And in reply, I hear Robert Moses in 1950s New York yelling at Jane Jacobs and her opposition to build a highway through Greenwich Village. There is nobody against this. Nobody, but a bunch of mothers. I'd lick the nipple shield and stick it on, and soon I didn't need it. I'd think of Thetis nursing her gleaming son, a milk-drunk bundle, and her hair floating in the underwater breeze. After all, I am a mammal. This is how I work, how he increases, how I battle my imperfection, his mortality.
Beautiful, Katie. Beautiful.
Really, yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us today. So where can people follow your work? Is there a place to follow you?
I thank you both so much for having me. This has been
Katie.
such a lovely conversation, and thanks for the podcast and all the great conversations you have here. My website is katiehartsock.com. I am not on any social media and haven't been.
Great credit.
Right, it is.
But there's updates on my website, and yeah.
Okay. Well, this has been a real blessing, and we're
Really
so
has.
you joined us.
I feel the same. Thank you so much.
See you soon, I hope.
I hope so.
We will.
And thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again next week. Until then.